welcome to another episode of the TLDR UK podcast. I am Zach Michaelis, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Ben Blissett.
Hello.
TLDR UK's lead writer, and Rory Taylor, TLDR's global lead writer. We're just going to go for it. You're global lead writer now. It's happened. You. Okay.
Hello.
Just a tiny bit of housekeeping before we get into stuff. We, as regular viewers will know, we moved these podcasts over to TLDR UK for a bit. We have since decided to move them back to TLDR podcast channel because they just look too much like normal videos, and a significant fraction of the audience was getting confused, and it seemed to be hurting our normal videos. But anyway, we're back on TLDR podcast, and this is where we'll probably stay from now on. So just a bit of housekeeping. In this podcast, we are going to be talking mostly about a new poll that was conducted by YouGov but published by the Telegraph, I'm right in saying, that suggests that things are perhaps even worse than Rishi Sunak is currently anticipating, and that he is on track to lose a sort of worse than 1997 style landslide to Keir Starmer's Labour Party. But as is custom on this podcast, before we get into that, we are going to do our underreported stories, which is when each of us find or pick a story that we think hasn't been sufficiently covered by the mainstream media this week. So, with all that being said, Rory, what is your unreported story?
Yes, I'm going close to home than usual with mine. So mine is a story from Northern Ireland. I think it was just this morning the news broke. There's going to be another recall of the Northern Ireland Assembly to try and elect a speaker. I think it's the sixth. It will be the sixth one since the last Northern Ireland Assembly election, which was in 2022, I believe. As people viewing this will probably know, the DUP are boycotting the Northern Irish political institutions in protest of post-Brexit related trading arrangements. I won't get into it too much, but I think this is an interesting one because we're getting to, I think, nearly 2 years now where Northern Ireland's political system has just been kind of vacant. And this is particularly significant at this moment because there's some public sector strikes going on over there. And the government has offered the money to give the pay rises that should stop those strikes, but they're not able to do that because there is no government, no assembly in Northern Ireland because of this boycott. So it's a pretty dire situation. But as things stand, it looks like when the assembly is recalled, I think it's going to be on Wednesday, that the DUP will still boycott the speakership election. So that will just continue, and the crisis will just go on. So I think that's something that we should probably be more aware of in England, especially.
I think as well, just UK media just does not pay nearly enough attention to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
I mean, when you consider that they haven't had Stormont hasn't been operating for a number of years because of various different boycotts. It's just, it's insane that it's not.
Yeah, and so much of it is, the DUP being passionately pro-union, but the other side of the union seems to not really pay that much interest to it unless there's a crisis going on there.
That's a good point.
So
There's a weird
quite
asymmetry there.
unweighted.
I never thought about it in those terms. You're right. I also think there's something really quite worrying, which is just how, with the dysfunction, how quickly the notion of losers' consent being eroded in Northern Ireland. I mean, power sharing only really functions as long as both sides of the aisle are happy to some extent to consent to the results. But if the sort of political dysfunction in the unionist camp means that results in some sense don't reflect the strength of union sentiment on the island, which I think will happen, then you can see that notion of losers' consent being strained. I mean, you already saw it when Sinn Féin came away as the largest party. And that was quite a psychological shock. Yeah, I think you're 100% right. Northern Irish politics is just generally underreported in the UK. Ben?
Yeah, so mine is a story from Iceland, which is that we've sort of spoken about this a few times on mainly the Daily Briefing. That there was a large sort of eruption predicted, which did sort of happen at the end of December. So it was the 18th of December. But there's been another one that's happened over this weekend. And the interesting thing is that it's all... the volcano is just outside a town called Grindavik, and they all evacuated before Christmas because they were expecting this eruption, and they all did sort of evacuate. The town was generally okay from it. A lot of them have come back only for this weekend to be told to leave again because there was another eruption, and this time it looks like it has sort of destroyed this town. There's a lot of people that aren't going to be able to go back there and all this. Don't think it's really been in the news too much, specifically because the news and the media spoke quite a lot about that this eruption was predicted, and the first eruption was covered quite a bit, but the second one hasn't really been covered too much. So there's about 4,000 inhabitants that that might not be able to go back. It's destroyed homes. You can see this video of just this like lava lake just rolling through this town and destroying homes and power stations and all this. So yeah, it's a pretty dire situation there. And yeah, it's worth pointing out as well that it's a different kind of eruption to the one that happened about 10 years ago. It's not disrupting air traffic in the same way, but for the people in this town, it really is messing with their lives.
Yeah, my underreported story this time it's to do with the Red Sea crisis. It's about the Suez Canal, but it's about specifically the Suez Canal and the fact that it's basically closed, the effect on the Egyptian economy, which I think is sort of understated. And this is essentially because Egypt is already in quite a long-running economic crisis. It's fundamentally like a currency crisis or maybe a balance of payments crisis. But it's basically that Egypt's debt to GDP ratio has been rising really steeply. Its currency has been depreciating. And basically the rate at which it pays on new borrowing has been going up for the last couple of years under President Sisi. And the Suez Canal is a massive source of foreign currency revenue for Egypt. And that's especially important because Egypt's central bank has been running through its foreign currency reserves. I think it might be negotiating a new deal with the IMF, but I'm not 100% sure. And again, the estimates vary as to how much of Egypt's foreign currency comes via the Suez Canal, but it's something like 15 to 25%, maybe 20%. If someone can find like recent data, that'd be great. And I think that the risk here is that a prolonged closure of the Suez Canal does risk pushing Egypt into like a more acute phase of its economic crisis. And on the one hand, you might expect this to be like sort of good for regional stability because it will sort of encourage the Egyptians to more aggressively push for de-escalation. But actually, I just don't think that's how an economic crisis in Egypt would interact with the wider crisis in the Middle East. I think it would just be yet another destabilizing node in that sort of what is turning out to be sort of a regional crisis. So yeah, I think that's an underreported element of the Red Sea crisis, which is mostly focused, I think, on the impact on sort of like Western shipping or Asia-Europe trade.
Yeah.
Anyway, those are the underreported stories. Let's take on to the main bit of the podcast. This poll and its publication seems sort of coordinated by a particular faction within the Conservative Party to undermine Rishi Sunak. So, Ben, do you want to run us through, let's just start with the poll itself. So what is in the poll?
Yeah, so the key thing to point out here is that it's not just sort of a poll in, as we've discussed before. Usually polls will take into account about 2,000, it'll survey about 2,000 people and will come up with, a percentage lead for any given party. This is different. This is an MRP poll, which means that they've surveyed a hell of a lot more people. It's about 14,000. And because they've surveyed more people, they're able to do it based on geography, specifically constituencies. So they're able to basically say which constituencies they think will flip and by how much. So in that sense, it's able to give you sort of an indication of the sort of like majorities in Parliament rather than just a simple...
Headline voting sort of thing.
Yeah, headline voting, yeah. So as you say, this was conducted by YouGov, but it was obviously heavily, represented by the Telegraph, and it was published by the Telegraph. It's done for the Telegraph, but it was YouGov that conducted the research. So as I say, it's about 14,000 adults. The key findings from this is that Labour would have a properly massive lead. So Labour would have a majority of 120. It'd put them on 385 seats. The Tories on just 169 seats, which is roughly in the territory of John Major in 1997 when he lost the election. That's the Tory seat share. And specifically, they say that 11 current cabinet ministers would lose their seat, including Jeremy Hunt and Penny Mordaunt. It also represents an 11.5% swing to Labour, which is pretty significant. And they also point out that no party has ever lost an election, the next election, with a majority that large. So they're saying that it's almost certain that if this was accurate, Starmer would have a minimum of sort of 2 terms. Another key finding from this as well is the Lib Dems going up to 48 seats from currently... Is it
they're on about 14 or something.
Yeah, it's not very high. But 48 is roughly in the territory of their sort of 2005, 2010 sort of territory before they lost a lot of them in 2015. Yeah. So that's quite significant. And the other significant thing, one last one, is the SNP. So obviously there's been a lot of talk about the SNP currently and the state of their party. They've been reduced down to 25 seats. I think we're around the 50 mark at the minute, with a lot of the seats going to Labour. And I know that we've spoken about this before in UK videos, but Labour's victory is very much predicated on the amount of seats that they win in Scotland, it looks like they are going to win quite a lot of seats in Scotland, possibly re-establishing Scotland as a bit of a Labour base. Not entirely, not as strong as it used to be, but at least enough to push them over the edge. So yeah, they're the sort of like headline figures from the poll, and specifically, it's really important to just remember why it's so significant. In that it's an MRP poll, a lot of people surveyed, and it gives you indications of how many seats each of the parties would get, rather than just a simple this like a 10-point lead or whatever.
Yeah, and then Rory, you were talking earlier in the office about the fact that so it's not just that obviously it's bad news for Sunak, but also this was, if I'm right, it's commissioned by a right-wing conservative think tank sort of thing. It was also published alongside some commentary by David Frost.
Yeah, so it was Conservative Britain Alliance and Lord Frost, David Frost, who commissioned it and then did this Telegraph, a few pieces in Telegraph, kind of analysing the numbers. So just to point out, there's no reason to like doubt YouGov's methods in actually conducting the poll and the results. That's all as normal. But the Telegraph's and Lord Frost's analysis of the data has kind of come under criticism from YouGov itself. So the way it was presented in the Telegraph was that the Tories are on course for a 1997 style defeat. However, if they can turn things around, if reform didn't run, then it could be a hung parliament, and it's possible that Labour wouldn't be the next government.
They point out that 96 of the seats that the Tories lose is a result of the reform.
Yes, yeah, and this is one of the key things that they've kind of come under fire for. So in the Telegraph's analysis, they were saying their assumption that would be the case if reform didn't run was that everyone who would vote reform would otherwise vote Tory, which just isn't the case. YouGov have come out and said, some would go to like UKIP and other splinter parties, some to Labour and other established parties, and some wouldn't vote at all. YouGov polling in October found only 31% of reform voters would be willing to vote Conservative if reform were not standing. So that's 31% is nowhere near the 100% that the Telegraph were assuming.
I mean, it's worth stressing quite how nonsensical that is. I mean, like the relevant counterfactual is just so clearly not every reform voter going to the Tories. Not least because, for the reason you mentioned, some of them vote Labour, some stay at home, like da-da. But also just because, fundamentally, every election since, really in modern, the last 30 years, there has been a group to the right of the Tories to capitalise on that bit of political sentiment in the UK.
So what's interesting there is you can kind of disregard the Telegraph's analysis of it and just go by what YouGov have said. I think is probably the right thing to do. But the fact that the Telegraph have taken this approach is quite an interesting kind of insight into that wing of the Tory party and what they're trying to do. So you can kind of see it as them attempting to push Sunak further to the right and saying to him, look, if you want to win, this is the only way you can win, by going further to the right, which has kind of been this pet project of David Frost and that kind of wing for a while
specifically
now.
In that commentary, doesn't Frost say specifically to go on the right on immigration? Yes. You have to move right on immigration. Yeah. And that is no coincidence. That comes 2 days ahead of this Rwanda vote, which is the third reading, of the Rwanda bill, of the new legislation. And that is due on Wednesday, am I right?
Yeah, I think it could, some amendments tomorrow, I think, or it might be the actual vote itself, but either Tuesday or Wednesday,
And why is this a problem for Sunak?
Well,
sorry, no, you go.
So this is a problem because at the beginning of last year, he set out his 5-point plan, and one of them was obviously stopping the boats. And the idea that none of the sort of legislative plans that he's come up with have really actually significantly reduced the number of small boats coming here, but also just the sort of vibe it gives off that he's staked his premiership on this small boats thing and he's not been able to deliver. There's a lot on the right that are sort of saying, that's why you're not doing well, that's why the polling's bad, that's why you need to go further. And this plan at the minute, he's managed to pitch it almost right between the centrists of his party and those on the right, so that the people in the centre are saying it goes too far, whereas those on the right are saying it's not going far enough.
The left of the Tory party, so the centre.
Yes. Are saying that it's not going far enough. So he's sort of being pulled by both sides, and there's a sort of fear this week that he could see quite a significant Tory rebellion against the bill, both from those Tory centrists and those on the right who are both unhappy for very different reasons. So it's not
kind of the worst position to be in, where both ends of the spectrum of your party don't like your legislation that is kind of your big centerpiece. If he stays in the middle, he might lose the vote. If he shifts one way or the other, he'll probably lose the people on either side. And I don't know what ignoring everything else, but I don't know what the most politically savvy move would be.
I think the Frost idea is the wrong one, though. The idea that in general and on immigration, the Tories need to move right is just confused.
They've been kind of saying that and doing that for, I don't know, a couple of years now, and it hasn't changed the polling at all, really.
There's vaguely an argument they need to, not move right on immigration, but as in get tough on immigration, but only because they promised to do so. Only because Sunak promised to do so. It's a question of competence rather than sort of general political orientation.
Stopping talking about it would probably be the best.
Yeah,
the best
but
option.
also I think there's another interesting piece of YouGov polling that came out not very long ago, which is that if you compare where voters perceive the Tories to be on various issues, and then compare that to sort of like prior British political history, the Tories are basically seen as right-wing as 2014, 2015, 2016 UKIP. And the idea that you need to go further right than sort of mid-2010s UKIP to win a general election is just patent nonsense.
I think as well, you've got to bear in mind that the most important issue to voters, and this is borne out in polling as well, is the economy and the cost of living. And, the fact that the Tories have lost the most they're no longer the most trusted party on the economy. I think that has surely got to be one of the biggest reasons that they're in such a polling deficit. That and the fact that their party has basically imploded in the last 2 years. So sort of stabilising the party and fixing the economy are probably the two main things you need to do. And I know what you're going to say is that Frost has also pointed out that you need to cut tax.
Well, that would be his solution to fixing the economy per se. But I think the Liz Truss experience probably quite clearly demonstrates that's not really a solution. Although I don't want to get into this too much, but I think people have misinferred lessons from the Liz Truss experience. I think that basically the Liz Truss thing, everyone inferred from that capital markets won't let us borrow that much money at nice, palatable rates. But I think it interacts in uncomfortable ways with the fact that the Bank of England was selling bonds at the same time. Yeah, this is a bit niche. But basically, I think that maybe there is more fiscal space for the UK than people assume or people have inferred from the Liz Truss experience. But I think the data suggests, international data suggests that I don't think tax cuts are the way to stimulate growth, especially not if you want to maintain levels of public services.
My point there is more that I just don't think that this analysis of the situation, that small boats is why we're losing. This is the main thing. This is what we need to focus on. And you see this in a lot of different Tory MPs over the weekend. I mean, Simon Clarke is one of the main ones who sort of come out and said, this is why we need to make the small boats thing work. It's I don't buy that analysis at all. That the reason that they're not doing well is because of small boats, and that's the big issue. I think the biggest issue is cost of living, and more specifically, trust in the Conservative Party, which has been absolutely destroyed in the last couple of years. Steadying the ship and stopping this ridiculous infighting is surely the top thing that they need to do, and fixing the economy as well, and sorting out. And obviously, it looks like they're going to do that. It looks like Jeremy Hunt's going to give some tax cuts away soon. So they're already sort of working on that. But just trying to fix this ridiculous infighting is surely the more important thing than causing more fighting about small boats.
There isn't really a way of fixing it, the Tory right.
Not going to war over small boats, though, is...
Yeah, but the Tory right are going to fight him on that unless he concedes to their demands. And if he does that, that's going to cause further infighting from the other side of the party. I don't think there is a way.
He can't stop the infighting. I think this comes back to the thing we've talked about so many times, which is stuck in this terrible feedback loop, the doom loop, where falling approval ratings and falling sort of headline polling just undermines unity, which in turn makes the polling worse, which undermines unity.
But I think my point is that he's staked so much of his premiership on small boats that he's made it a much larger thing than he needed to. And because he's done that, that's caused more infighting than he necessarily needed to.
Yeah, I think always point is that now he's done that, there's no way back.
Yeah, sure, okay.
Anyway, okay. So I think, is that everything we want to talk about with the poll? Anything?
There's one, I didn't really know how to fit this in, but it's quite fun for some people, bit of
exciting
data from the poll is that none of the constituencies it's all 650 constituencies. In no constituency do the Tories poll above 40%, according to this poll.
Oh, that is fascinating.
And
actually,
to have nothing above 40% is absolutely terrible for a party. When they've got, I don't know how many seats now, but plenty over 50%, a few over 60%. That is a real disaster if that actually is borne out in the actual election.
I think as well, and this is related to that, the amount of, I can't remember who said it, it might have been Lord Frost himself actually, that said something like, the best we can hope for is a 1997 sort of wipeout. That's their best case scenario on the back of this poll.
Yeah.
Which is pretty devastating.
Yeah. I also think that this goes back to something, it's fun to cast your mind back to whatever it is, a year ago, 9 months ago, when Sunak first came in. And basically the big question was, would Tory poll numbers go up to reach Sunak's personal approval ratings, or would Sunak's personal approval ratings come down?
We've got a resounding answer.
Down and then a bit more, which is just poor guy.
I think also it's worth remembering as well 2019 and what, your thoughts of how things are going to work over the next 5 years on the day that we realised Johnson had won this massive majority. You know, the Labour worst election defeat since 1935 or whatever. And
how it's panned out. This is a fun question. Do you think Boris Johnson would do better than Rishi Sunak? He can swipe in. He's just in 2 days' time. You know, like Sunak resigns voluntarily. Johnson just.
I think if they
back.
never got rid of Johnson, they'd be doing a lot better now. I think, in a sense, you know, if the ultimate goal was just the Tories to win the highest number of seats, getting rid of Johnson was the wrong move. But I think if you were to bring him back, I think it just undermines the Tory unity thing even more, and I think he'd do worse. So if he'd have stayed on and never got rid of him, I think they'd be doing way better. But if you just bring him back, no.
It's very hard. I don't think they'd be doing better if they brought him back, but I also don't think they'd be doing better if he stayed on. Because I think
you're a Johnson pessimist.
Yeah, because I think he left kind of at the peak of his unpopularity. You know, when there were scandals and all sorts of terrible things going on. If he was in for another 2 years after that, there'd have just been more bad things. You know, like all this COVID inquiry stuff would have been a lot more relevant because he'd still be prime minister. I just think he would have continued cratering until the next election.
I think he'll win in 2024. Do it, Tories. Come on, let's have it.
Yeah.
I'd love another go.
Switch on a new leader will help. I'm sure that'll do it. Yeah. One more.
Please.
One more.
Trust our instincts. Okay, so that's
if he loses the Rwanda vote this week, you might be in the money with him.
Maybe I should put 10 on Boris Johnson to win in 2024. The odds would be phenomenal. Wow.
He's got to
He'd be retiring.
Come back as an MP first.
Yeah. Okay, all right. I think that's everything. This takes us on to the final bit of the podcast, which is the Global Leaderboard. For new viewers, this is when we basically take a look at what's happened in the past week or so, or since we last did the podcast, and we pick one world leader to go up and one world leader to go down. Again, as always, this is not a reflection of our personal politics. Sometimes people look at the board and they see Vladimir Putin at the top and they think that we're all massive Russophiles, but it's just that from that individual perspective, how was their week? So, Rory, do you want to start with who's going down?
So I'm moving down Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. This is because Maldives.
You've got to have a reason, Rory.
Yeah,
you can't just
says Maldives in brackets. I remember that. Yeah. This is because there's been this slightly odd diplomatic spat between the Maldives and India in the last couple of weeks. Initially seemed very futile and very kind of irrelevant. It was to do with Modi posing on a beach for some photos. You might know this better than me, Zach. He was posing on a beach for some photographs that some ministers in the Maldives thought was him trying to tell people in India, don't go on holiday to the Maldives, stay in India. They said some rude things about him and got suspended and caused a bit of a spat. But probably more importantly than that is that the new president of the Maldives, who was elected last year, has ordered this small contingent of Indian troops that has a presence in the Maldives out of the country. He's sending them back to India. So that's pretty bad for Indian influence in the country. The Maldives has been kind of in the centre of this battle for influence between India and China. So the guy who was elected last year, he's kind of anti-India, pro kind of warmer ties with China. So that's just this kicking out of Indian troops is the first step in reversing the current setup, I suppose.
Yeah, I'd just say it's not funny necessarily, but some of the quotes are quite entertaining. So again, he was just walking on a beach and it was in furs, and some Maldivian politicians basically sort of assumed that was an implicit diss about how nice the Maldives are as a holiday destination. And so some of the quotes from Maldives ministers include calling Modi a clown, a terrorist, and a puppet of Israel, which is pretty strong for walking on a beach. I think these are, these sort of things are interesting just because they are so clearly like proxies for the wider Indo-China battle. One thing I do think is a bit interesting, and that I think especially true of India, is that I don't know whether or not it's conscious or not, but India does seem to have its own form of what you might describe as wolf warrior diplomacy. And I think that's a mistake, just because I think that the China obviously was big. The wolf warrior diplomacy refers to a diplomatic style that certain Chinese officials adopted in the late 2010s. It's named after a film, the Wolf Warrior series, I think. And it's just basically about being very, very aggressive on social media and basically taking anything as like a sort of national slight. And and they've really toned it down in like the past year or two. It's really, really conspicuous. It's very easy to forget quite how hawkish the rhetoric was from certain Chinese officials, even on stuff like Twitter, especially during the pandemic when they would just like any world leader who like floated the lab leak theory or anything like that would just get launched on, and they'd just be, they'd come out with all loads of stuff. And that is quite conspicuously different to the tone they take today. I mean, the Chinese diplomatic messaging is far more restrained. That's just fundamentally because actually it wasn't very effective. It plays well with your domestic base. There were basically parts of the Chinese like electorate or public who were very happy with that. But it's a really bad strategy for like establishing soft power. And I think India should probably be wary of that. I imagine similar domestic dynamics are at play in that sort of like nationalist, quite jingoistic, bellicose rhetoric plays well, or like reactions play well with the Indian public, but it might not be a good strategy in the long term. And maybe that's unfair. I mean, I should probably double check the comments from the government of India, but you do see those sort of opinions or that sort of style being mimicked by certain Indian officials. It's a good story. I like that story. We've been considering doing a main video on it for a while. I don't know if we're going to. It might be a good daily briefing story for the next couple of days. Ben, explain yourself.
So, when doing research, I don't think there's that many people that can go up this week. In fact, I don't think anyone can really legitimately have a claim to going up. So, as a result of that, I mean, I have people that could go down, but as we pointed out, the whole reason the board works is because if you have one person going up, one person down each week, the board moves in sort of a fair and equal way.
Can I offer you someone to go up? I have someone else. But can I offer you someone to go up?
You can offer.
And then you can have your down and we can still have an even board.
Sure, yeah.
So a tentative up, that I don't think is actually necessarily all that honest, but we can go for it, is Mohammed bin Salman.
In what way?
In that the Houthis, who are obviously one of Saudi Arabia's long-term like rival or enemies, as it were, although that's maybe not a fair description given they've been in like a ceasefire since April 2022, are now they are the enemy of the international community. And that should, in some sense, be good for Saudi Arabia if they want to get rid of the Houthis. They now have a lot more international support in that endeavor. The reason I say it's tentative is because I think that the Saudis actually, it might be good. Some Saudi leaders might want that, but actually I think the Saudis' priority is regional stability, which is why they signed that ceasefire in 2022. And you see that in the way they reacted to the Houthi strikes. They released a statement calling for restraint and avoiding escalation, which is, again, it's a very clear sign that their priority there is not actually taking out the Houthis, which, by the way, isn't feasible given the Houthis control 70% of Yemen's population and have survived years of Saudi-led barrages. But nonetheless, there's a sense in which, just if you're looking through the narrow prism of the Saudi-Houthi rivalry, the last couple of weeks have been good for the Saudis. You can have it if you want.
I'll take it.
Okay, fine. So he's going up, and then that leaves me as my up. My up today is going to be Giorgia Meloni, and we have struggled for ups. We'll be honest this week, but the reason Meloni's going up, I just think it's quite a fun one. And this is something I've been struck by in the last 6 months or so, is that there is an enormous power vacuum at the centre of the EU. We've talked about loads. Macron is uniquely unpopular, and he's becoming not a lame duck president, but he doesn't have the political power that he once did. Scholz is probably even less popular. And the thing that made Germany the European superpower that it was in the 2010s and even until very, very recently are fading. It has, its economy is fading. It is borrowing more money, which is, one of the things that established as a superpower was the Eurozone crisis when it got to do its whole, look at me, I was so right in never borrowing money. And Meloni, at least according to Morning Consult polling, is still quite popular, especially by Italian standards. She's polling at 41% approval rating, which are numbers that only, Meloni, that Scholz and Macron can only dream of. And as we mentioned in the last podcast with me and Rory, I do think her politics is entering the European mainstream. And sometimes people say that Meloni's not as radical as she pretended to be during the election. I think that's partly true, but I think it's also that the European median, the European centre, has moved towards, especially on stuff like immigration. And also that thing we talked about last podcast about the civilizational understanding of the European Union, which Meloni very clearly subscribes to. So I basically think there's a power vacuum in the EU, and Meloni is sort of filling it. She is becoming one of the EU's leading figures, and I think that is actually quite unprecedented. I think that Italian politicians have not really ever, especially ones that are not technocrats, have rarely been considered sort of like leading figures in the EU.
So I started with the person going down for me, but you guys have done your 2 ups.
Yeah.
So we're slightly unbalanced at the moment.
we paused that up.
Yeah.
Sorry. That's Ben's fault for trying to disrupt the format. But
That's my bad.
Yeah.
To be fair.
Okay, well, fine. You're
I'll
going
put my
up
person
now,
up, yeah.
and we'll go our downs
Yes.
second. Okay.
So moving up for me is Xi Jinping.
Okay.
Half because of the Maldives
It's
thing.
only about to get more complicated.
Yeah.
So India losing influence in the Maldives, that's part of it. But the main reason I wanted to do it was because Nauru, this tiny Pacific island nation, has abandoned Taiwan and shifted its diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China. So I think that leaves Taiwan with just 11 countries left now officially recognizing it. And China's kind of just been picking off these small countries gradually, leaving Taiwan with fewer and fewer diplomatic allies. So yeah, good news for Xi Jinping there. Yeah.
Well, I'm moving Xi Jinping down.
Same.
Oh dear.
This is chaos.
Yeah. And this is because of the Taiwan election results and the fact that it's a sort of separatist, or one that would a separatist party has won the election, which she doesn't like terribly.
I probably wouldn't call
well.
the DPP a separatist party. I mean, they're more sympathetic to independence.
Sure, okay. Maybe that was a bit strong.
Yeah.
But
I think
one
they would
that's more
not subscribe to that.
pro-independence than
Sure.
the sort of KMT. So yes.
I mean, I was also going. This is interesting because this is more than just a discussion about Xi, and he's got 2 ups now, so he is going to go up. You've been outvoted.
Yeah.
We've got to keep the board even. But I think one of the things that the reasons that the Taiwanese election was tough for China is obviously the result in itself. But I think that the DPP's new policy on independence, which is that we are already de facto independent, therefore we don't have to announce independence. It's a really clever little shift, and it just means that there's not going to be a point, there's not going to be a trigger for escalation, but they've nonetheless moved further towards being a sort of independent state, if that's the right way of putting it. And I do think that makes life quite difficult for China when it comes to Taiwan, because I think that the status quo before was that you would never make a formal declaration of independence, and therefore China would never have there would never be a provocation that required a military response from China. But now that they've sort of just crossed into, it's a tacit declaration of independence that has sort of gone without retaliation. And I think that makes it very hard for China to find a reason to escalate. Although I'm not saying that we should rule it out. But I do think that is difficult. And I do think that has been a net bad week for poor Xi Jinping.
So
he's staying where he is then?
He's going down.
Because I moved him up 1. You moved him down 2, so he's going down 1.
He's going
I guess.
down 1.
Yeah.
But if it's for the same reason, does he not? Is it not just one move down if we're both saying he's going down for similar sort of?
I think if you've been outvoted, he goes down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, that's how you make sure that the board stays
Yeah.
even. Or that being said, that just means we have tons of people on that rung there.
What chaos.
I'll do that now.
What chaotic ending?
Yeah. Need to see what the state of the board is after this.
Well, it's good to know that Starmer and Putin remain on
Unbeatable. That is a very busy line there, isn't it?
Okay.
Trudeau's got a whole little section to himself.
Anyway, all right. So thank you very much for watching the TLDR UK podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. We're sorry for the chaos of moving between channels. It will be on this one from now on. We can commit to that with some degree of certainty. With utter certainty. Thank you very much for watching. We hope you enjoyed, and we will see you again. On this channel, we'll see you again on Thursday because we are moving the global podcast for very much the same reasons back from TLDR Global onto this channel, TLDR Podcast. So if you enjoyed this, see you on Thursday. If not, well, have a good one. Very good.